we have a lot to talk about. There is just an incredible amount of things happening as we look at what is coming down in the future, and it looks like there might be some trouble ahead. We often talk, again, I'll remind you each week, about the convergence of all the different events. All these things are going to happen in that last period of time from the rebirth of the nation of Israel until the Lord returns, and there's going to be this compression. And all these things are going to get more and more intense as we get closer and closer to the second coming of the Lord. So we will see the beginnings of a lot of these things, if they're not being fulfilled already, as we sit here and watch. Why do we study Bible prophecy? One of the reasons we do that, Hebrews chapter 10, it says this, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembly together, as is the habit of some, but what? Encouraging one another, and all the more encouraging one another as you see the day drawing near." That's what we are supposed to be focused on. In fact, if you look through each of the chapters of 1 Thessalonians and even into 2 Thessalonians, there's a tremendous correlation between belief in the second coming, a firm belief in the second coming, and looking for the second coming, and the sanctification of the believer. In fact, it's almost impossible to have, in my view, the sanctification of the believer without a strong belief in the second coming. Ephesians chapter 6 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." And that's part of what we try to equip you here by focusing on events that are going on in the world and things going on in the culture to help shape your worldview so that you can be able to stand better in the last days and focus on the blessed hope, knowing that the return of the Lord is very near. This verse in Ephesians, by the way, just precedes a passage about the armor of God, which you should go read, because there's a very heavy eschatological or prophetic component to the armor of God if you read through that passage and study. We'll talk more about that in the future. And then finally, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." That ought to be our motto. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the economy. There was a conference that Bill went to. There are a lot of different things that are going on. All these are kind of converging. Each week, I was talking to Bill a little bit to Katie this week, and it's just like I can't keep up with everything that's going on. It's just overwhelming. So this will be our new, I think, maybe symbol of our economic news. Everything's going down the drain. This is an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday called "America's Baby Bust." Listen to this. What they're talking about is that people just aren't having babies like they used to. That's bad news. Because a lot of pensions and that type of thing are tied to the fact that we expect that there will be workers behind us, economic activity behind us, and if there are fewer people, less activity, less income, less taxes. It's so if you're at the verge of senior age, like a lot of us, you want to avoid those death panels, encourage your children and young friends to have babies. So here's just some stats from this. For more than 3 decades, Chinese women have been subjected to their country's brutal one-child policy. Those who try to have more children have been subjected to fines and forced abortions. Their houses have been razed and their husbands fired from their jobs. As a result, Chinese women have a fertility rate of 1.54. That's bad. That's very bad. You need 2.1 average children per woman to have replacement population, just to stay even. Anything below that is a problem. In fact, with the one-child policy in China and the favoring of boys, And then you also have the favoring of girls in India, where women are viewed as an economic burden to raise because you have to pay a dowry to get them married off. Boys are viewed as an economic boon for the family. There's been a tremendous shift in the demographics of the population in India, so much so that within a generation or less in India, they estimate that there will be somewhere around 100 million males that have no prospect of a wife. In China, they're already at that number because of the one-child policy. Now, there is a prophecy in Revelation that talks about an army coming from the east of 200 million. I don't know if there's a connection between the two, but this is something that's really unprecedented in history. Continuing on this, here in America, white college-educated women, a good proxy for the middle class, have a fertility rate of 1.6. America has its very own one-child policy, and we have chosen it for ourselves. In fact, if Myra Triplet wasn't around, that number might be 1.4 or 1.5. But so at least somebody's carrying their weight around here. Forget the debt ceiling, forget the fiscal cliff, the sequestration cliff, and the entitlement cliff. Those are all just symptoms. What America really faces is a demographic cliff. The root cause of most of our problems are a declining fertility rate. The nation's falling fertility rate underlies many of our most difficult problems. Once a country's fertility rate falls consistently below replacement, its age profile begins to shift. You get more old people than young people, and eventually, as the bloated cohort of old people dies off, population begins to contract. This dual problem, a population that is disproportionately old and shrinking overall, has enormous economic, political, and cultural consequences. Boy, does it ever. Again, we look at this. This is an article that was on Zero Hedge yesterday. That's a blog that I read. I don't agree with everything that I read there, by the way. I think their views on foreign policy are a little bit crazy, but I think their economic analysis is often very good, that we've worked ourselves into this problem where the most important people are really not politicians or presidents, but central bankers, because they keep throwing money into the economy to make everybody think that everything's okay. And you can see that everybody thinks everything okay because the Dow hit 14,000 for the first time in 4 years, or almost 5 years this week. But this is a non-financial sector debt showing how real debt levels between government, private sector, household, and corporate are all increasing. And this data only goes through 2009. What's being proposed to right the ship in various Western countries especially is a one-time wealth tax. And this, you've heard this rumored about. It's being talked about more and more and more, that they will just go and say, okay, you have so much in your retirement account, we get, right now the number, this was, I think this number's actually gone up, the U.S. would be a 26% tax. So how many of you have factored that into your retirement program? Some countries, look at Ireland. Ireland's household financial assets are less than necessary for debt reduction. Excuse me one moment. Okay, I'm going to trust that this is recording. If not, we're going to have to lay down the track, and that's just a lot more work. One of the places that the culture, unfortunately, is having an impact is on the church. This is an article that I saw yesterday. I don't remember where. Evangelical churches refine message on gay issues. Listen to what it says in this article. The pressure to change the way homosexuality is addressed in evangelical churches is increasing as mainstream support for gay and lesbian issues increases. This support is especially strong among young adults and researchers say they don't expect this group to become more conservative on the issue as they get older. If you look at the numbers, you see here, staunch conservatives are 85% opposed to allowing gays and lesbians to marry at the top. All the way at the bottom are solid liberals that are 85% in favor of allowing gays to, and lesbians to marry legally. And you can see some of the differences in the middle. Libertarians are pretty much evenly divided. Main Street Republicans are 72 to 23 opposed. New Coalition Democrats 51 to 34% opposed. Postmoderns, those would be younger people, 80 to 12. In fact, there's some other stats here from the Pew Forum. In the 18 to 29 age range, they find that 62% favor gay marriage, 71% favor civil unions, or would support it. 65 or over, those numbers drop to 31%, but civil unions have a majority support of people over the age of 65. Here's a quote from the article. Evangelicals have been sobered by studies that show people are dropping out of church in droves, said Bill Leonard, Dean of Wake Forest University's Divinity School. That has affected how they relate to marginalized people, including gays and lesbians. Amazed at the changes, the softening of the rhetoric to be more compassionate, Leonard said. David Key, director of Baptist Studies at Emory University's Chandler School of Theology, said it is the pastors who are de-emphasizing homosexuality who are attracting more members. Let me read that. The pastors who are de-emphasizing homosexuality as a sin and the biblical teaching about it are the ones who are attracting more members. It's a free market system, he said, noting that there is no evangelical equivalent of the Pope to enforce a certain doctrine. And because many evangelical churches are less hierarchical than their mainline Protestant counterparts, changes in attitude or practice can sometimes go under the radar. There's never a proclamation, a resolution doesn't pass, it's just the people go silent on the issue. And you heard that when Lou Giglio said that he was dropping out of the inauguration festivities because he had spoken about it 15 or 20 years previously, and he said when he dropped out in his statement, it's just something I haven't talked about for 15 or 20 years. And then I pointed out last week that Andy Stanley was invited to speak, and do you think that he would have been invited to speak if he had ever spoken out about homosexuality being a sin? Not a chance. Not a chance. The reality is, when all of society has moved in a certain direction, you just have to be silent. This is what is prophesied, Paul prophesied in 2 Timothy. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Jesus Christ, who has judged the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So people are going to want to have their ears tickled. They want teachers who will tell them what they want to hear. And they're going to eventually, they'll turn away from the truth and turn aside to myths. In fact, in the article it cites Dr. Robert Jeffers, the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, who said that he's changing the way he talks about it because they have gay and lesbian members in their church. And we have to focus on all the other sins as well. And I don't disagree with focusing on all the sins that people have, but there is one that Jesus said would be characteristic of the last days. And there's one that seems to be getting a pass, and you ought to go and look. Jesus said in the book of Luke that it would look at the days of Lot, and what it will be like at the end will be like it was in the days of Lot. And go read about Lot. Read about Lot in 2 Peter, where it describes the oppression that man felt because of what was going on in the city in which he lived. And that is what Jesus said will be the pattern of the world just before he returns. And I would submit to you that when evangelical churches start to de-emphasize any sin, it's a very, very bad sign. Very bad sign. Well, in the sense that it means that the culture's winning, the devil's winning, and the truth is losing. But it also is a good sign in the sense that Jesus is coming. So that's one of the things we should look at and take hope. Well, last week I told you that I would look at the inauguration and some of the things that went on there. We talked a little bit about Andy Stanley's message. I want to play a little bit of Adam Hamilton's message to you at the prayer service the morning after the inauguration. This would have taken place on Tuesday morning, the 22nd. One of the things that happened at this prayer service at our nation's cathedral, the nation's church they call it, was this. So that was in the church, the National Cathedral. Here's Adam Hamilton speaking. He's pastor of Church of the Resurrection. He's the one I played a clip of him a couple weeks ago where he essentially said, look, I've looked at the Bible, and there's things I trust the authority of the Bible, but there's just things that were for old times and things that, it just doesn't apply anymore. And he was talking about mainly the issue of homosexuality. So here's a few clips, short ones, from his sermon at the National Cathedral.
Over the last 2 weeks, I've been praying a lot. God, what would you have me say to these remarkable people? And the first thing I felt God wanted me to say to you was simply thank you. Thank you. A friend of mine once told me, he said there are 3 reasons why people seek public office. The first is there are some who want to feel important and they want all the power affords them. He said there's a second group, and those folks are just a little off in the head. But he said there's a third group who really want to make a difference. They really want to change the world for the better. And I believe that represents you, and all of you in this administration and leadership in our country.
He was talking to the president. He's a United Methodist minister.
Now, there are 2 things we learn about Moses' heart and character in the Scriptures. Numbers tells us...
He gives his text that he was using was the story of Moses to relate this to the president.
That the man Moses was a humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. God chooses and uses those who humble themselves before him and before others. Young Mary, the mother of Jesus, in her Magnificat says that God scatters the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, but lifts up the lowly. Jesus teaches the same thing when he turns to his disciples who were arguing on the night before he would be crucified, which one was the greatest. And he says to them, you don't understand. That's how the kings of the world operate, but that's not how you operate. He said, the first among you, the one who would be great, will be your servant. And then he washed his disciples' feet. Ultimately, he risked his life to stand before Pharaoh and to demand that Pharaoh release the slaves. And he led them into the wilderness towards the promised land. This is what God looks for in the Scriptures from every king, every rabbi, every leader. He looks for those who will take seriously the call to justice, to do kindness, to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. James says it this way, true religion and undefiled before God is to care for the widows and the orphans. And Jesus says at the last judgment, it all comes down to this. How did you respond to the needs of the least of these?
By the way, that's a reference to the passage in Matthew chapter 25, and that is a total, complete misinterpretation of that scripture. But that is probably one of the ones that maybe someday we ought to go through different texts and, Bible texts that are the most misinterpreted. That is one. Judge not that you be not judged would be another. But this one in Matthew 25, that's not what happens at the final judgment, Dr. Hamilton. Not at all. He continues.
The second thing we learn from Moses is the importance of having a vision. Professor John Cotter, now retired from Harvard Business School, noted that 2 of the most important tasks of any leader are to cast a compelling vision for the future and then to inspire and motivate people to pursue it. That vision has to be a clear and compelling picture of where we want to go, our preferred picture of the future. Moses led the slaves out of Egypt, but that was not enough. Very quickly, they grumbled and began to desire to go back to Egypt, where there were leeks and cucumbers to eat. It was at least safe there. The wilderness was hard. Moses had to constantly remind them of the vision. He said, we're marching to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, where we can worship freely, where we can love, where we can practice justice, where we can live in harmony. A compelling vision unifies us. It excites us. It leads people to a willingness to sacrifice and imbues them with a sense of purpose. Cotter suggested that the average American company struggled with a lack of vision, a compelling vision at least. As a pastor, I can tell you the same is true of local churches, congregations across the country who don't remember their purpose, and they no longer see a compelling vision for the future. And sadly, this feels true of America today. With our two-party system, vision casting often feels like mere political rhetoric. And we typically are offered two different visions competing with one another, not one unifying vision. To many Americans, we feel like a house divided that cannot stand. We find ourselves desperately longing to find common ground, to find a common vision, to be one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for everyone. In this city and in this room are the people who can help. This may be, this bringing together our country, a more important issue than anything else you face. Because until we resolve our differences here, or at least find some unifying vision that brings us together, we're going to find it very, very difficult to solve any other problems we're facing. Debt ceilings, issues of health care. Proverbs notes this: without a vision, the people perish. They don't literally perish. They just bicker and fight and become so polarized they can't get anything done.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, he never cited any scripture about churches having a vision. The church's mission is laid out in scripture. This is leadership network, business school stuff. He cited the business school guy. Got to have a vision, got to have a vision, got to have a vision. Why don't you just go back and do what the Bible says you're supposed to do? That's very simple. And his citation of the verse in Proverbs, this is another one we can put on the list of misinterpreted Bible passages. You hear it all the time. Without vision, the people perish. If you look at the context of that verse, what it really says is without the word of God, people perish. So again, this man committed malpractice. One more clip.
God has given you a unique gift, Mr. President. Unlike any other president we've ever had, you have the ability to cast vision and inspire people. You should have been a preacher. God actually has you exactly where God wants you. And yesterday you began to lay out a vision for us in your inaugural address that was very powerful and compelling. Somewhere we've got to find and forge one or two dreams or visions that people on the right and the left, the Republicans and Democrats, have come together to say, yes, we can stack hands on this. Even just one or two. And you pointed to that. You hinted towards that yesterday. We have to remember our picture of the promised land. And when we do that, anything is possible in America. I'll offer one small example of the power of vision from the church that I serve in Keene.
Okay, we'll go into that. But so how's America's pastor, Rick Warren, doing? Well, this is a short clip. Rick was on Oprah's Life class a couple weeks ago. Here's just a clip of some of what went on there.
A few months ago, Pastor Rick gave a sermon about poker. Everybody says it's one of your best ones ever. I haven't heard all of them, but that one was pretty darn good, let's say. Okay, tell us what it's about.
Well, a guy, Oprah, told me, he said, you know, life is like a game of poker. You have to play the hand you're dealt.
Yes.
So I started thinking about that. I thought, so what's the hand? What are the cards? And as I thought about it, I thought the cards that we're dealt are the things we don't have control over.
Yeah.
I didn't choose when I was born, where I was born. I didn't choose my parents, my gender, my race, my natural abilities, my natural weaknesses, my disabilities, my abilities, these things like this. But a wise player can even play what seems to be a weak hand and win the game.
Really?
And can win the game. And so there are ways to take what you were given and actually make the most of it.
Okay. If you want to, he had a deck of cards there. No Bible, by the way. Okay, let's go into Middle East. This is, there's a video. I will play a trailer from this. It's called The Gatekeepers. And they're talking about the extreme right more dangerous to Israel than the Iranian bomb. Meaning religious people are more dangerous to Israel than the Iranian bomb. Now, the reason why I put that up there, you have to see what's in this movie, which focuses on the religious right in Israel, was that there was an event this week in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club called Christian Zionism and American Islamophobia. There were 4 speakers on the panel at that thing. The first one was a man named Phil Giraldi, who gave a little short, they all gave about a 10-minute talk, and then they opened the thing to questions. His was the political impact of Christian Zionism.
I'm sorry, was that meant to be ironic, the place where it was held? Did you notice that? In
First Amendment Lounge? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the political impact of Christian Zionism. Now, Phil Giraldi is he was one of the top foreign policy advisors to Ron Paul. He was the man who supposedly leaked the story about the Nigerian yellow cake and the forged documents and everything, which later turned out to be a complete fabrication. So, but Bill Koenig was there. Bill went, and I'll play a little clip of Bill in just a moment. But I wanted to give you a sense of where all this is heading, because you need to know that the theme of the conference was the reason there's not peace in the Middle East is because of all these crazy Christian Zionists in America that support the nation of Israel. And uncritically support everything that Israel does. And I want you to know, I don't uncritically support everything that Israel does. For example, when Israel gives land for peace, I don't support that, okay? So I don't support everything that Israel does. But listen, I'll play a few clips of this, and then we'll play a little clip of Bill. And
Christian Zionism, by definition, consists of Christians, normally Protestant evangelicals, who believe that the book of Revelations predicts that certain steps must be taken to bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ, at which point the believers themselves will be raptured up to heaven. Many Christian Zionists believe that the second coming will happen soon, and because the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a precondition of that, they support the government and people of Israel completely and unconditionally in all that they do, to include the expansion by force into historic Judea, which would include what remains of the Palestinian West Bank. Another aspect of Christian Zionism is the belief that the end time, as they refer to it, will be preceded by an enormous battle pitting the forces of good against the forces of evil, in which all the evildoers will be destroyed and the righteous will be triumphant. The battle is supposed to take place at Armageddon, an undisclosed location in the Middle East that some believe is derived from the name of the ancient Hittite capital Megiddo.
by the way, the only place that historians a couple hundred years ago had ever heard of the Hittites was by reading the Bible, and then archaeology later discovered the Hittites. And because a lot of people said, you can't believe the Bible, it talks about the Hittites, and there is no such thing as the Hittites. But it turned out that the Bible was true in that regard. So here's some more from Dr. Giraldi. By the way, he's a former CIA guy. So to give you concern about what the CIA is doing.
So the bottom line for me is that the Christian Zionist involvement in American politics on behalf of the U.S. relationship with Israel does not serve any conceivable national interests unless one assumes that Israel and the United States are essentially the same, which is unsustainable. On the contrary, the Christian Zionist politicizing has been a major element in supporting the generally obtuse U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East region and elsewhere in the Muslim world. It serves a particularly narrowly construed parochial interest that, ironically, is intended to bring about the end of the world, possibly a victory for gentlemen like Pastor John Hagee if his interpretation of the Bible is correct, but quite likely a disaster for the rest of us.
By the way, in case you haven't kind of got the flow of where everything's going, this was not supportive of Christian Zionism, okay? I just want to make sure, I wasn't sure if you'd all picked that up yet, but here's John Utley. I was doing some research for Bill Koenig. I Googled John Utley, and he said, I have an article you can read, and I found it on David Duke's website, the racist Ku Klux Klan guy supporting it. His talk was Christian Zionism, the Armageddon Lobby, and the Shaping of American Foreign Policy. By the way, what I'll do is I'm going to send to you or put up on the YouTube website the links to the full videos of this conference that Bill Koenig went to this week.
I was at a heritage event some years ago, and they asked the editors of major newspapers in the United States, how is the 21st century evolving different to what your people imagined? And they all said none of us ever imagined the return to religious fundamentalism of the great religions, the great Western religions, what happened and what is happening.
So that's very telling too, because they didn't. He was talking about the major editors of media, newspapers in the United States, and they asked him what's changed in our culture that you didn't expect, and people are becoming more religious. I mean, we thought, with education and everything, that they would rise above those simplistic notions that you find in these holy books, indicating where mainstream culture
There's
is.
a lot of revenge fantasy. Vanity Fair did an article on this, a revenge fantasy in which right-wing Christians win out over the rational, scientific, modern, post-Enlightenment world. Liberals, gays, abortion, all driving Christ out of the public square. I might add the evangelical reaction sort of came when the U.S. government got into the schools, taking away prayer, the abortion, and so on.
Yep, he's right. Next speaker was a guy in evangelical Christian Zionism views Islam, a PhD man named Norman Mizvinsky. And he had a particularly, well, I'll let you judge for yourself.
Whereas a dispute may exist about the actual number, there should be no dispute about the fact that the evangelical Christian Zionists have established one of the most influential and efficient political lobbies in this country. The Christian Zionist lobby is at least as influential as the Israel lobby in maintaining and expanding American support for Zionism, the State of Israel, and Israeli policies regarding the Palestinian-Israeli, Arab-Israeli conflict. Christian Zionist groups and leaders lobby and pressure members of Congress, presidents of the United States, and administration officials with great success.
He also went on to say that it's Christian Zionists that create Islamophobia because they go to sympathetic Arabs to interpret and translate the Quran. And so, for example, the doctrine of abrogation is a manufactured thing by Zionists, Christian and Israeli Zionists. Do you know what the doctrine of abrogation is? In the Quran, there are passages that were written when Muhammad lived in Medina. This is the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, by the way. This is where Muhammad, you will find his body, where he's dead, where he's still dead, where everybody believes he's still dead, okay? And this bare area here in the foreground is the graveyard. Now, I believe his body lies within the mosque. By the way, that mosque, to give you some idea as to how large it is, it's very apparent if you do a Google Earth or a Google Maps search for Medina, or I think it's Madinah on Google. That mosque will accommodate at least 500,000 people at one time. Okay, so when he was in Medina and he wrote or supposedly received the revelation of the Quran, there were a lot of passages. He was weak at that time. He was under pressure. There were tribes that were attacking him. Things were not going well. So it was be peaceful, be nice, be kind, do all these things, okay? Then there are the passages, the surahs, the chapters of the Quran that were written in Mecca. And this is, we talked a little bit about this last week. This is sort of a 3D image of what the Grand Mosque in Mecca looks like today, with this building, which currently I believe is the second tallest building in the world, immediately to the one side of the mosque. There are plans underway to, on the other side from where this picture is taken, to create these towers. All of these towers are 50, 60 stories for residences, hotels, and that type of thing. And also there are plans to expand the mosque, which right now, this area of the Grand Mosque can accommodate about 2 million people at one time, to expand it to where it will be able to accommodate at least 5 million people at one time. All of this is funded by oil money. So when he was in Medina or Mecca, he wrote different surahs, and these surahs say things like this. Surah 9:5. Then when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters, and that's Jews and Christians, wherever you find them, and take them captive and besiege them and prepare them for each ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor due, pay the tax, then leave their way free. Allah is forgiving and merciful in that case. 963 says, know they not that whoso opposeth Allah and his messenger, his verily is fire of hell to abide therein. That is the extreme abasement. So there were some questions asked of Dr. Mizvinsky, and one of the questions...
Are there some Elmer Gantries involved who are in it for the money? Even without knowing, we could say almost certainly yeah.
He's talking about Christian Zionists. Are there some that are just in this for the money? Because someone in the audience stood up and said, well, these guys are just doing it for the money, right? I mean, we all know the Jews have the money, and they're giving some to the Christians to get them on board for their Zionist dream.
But does that mean that that is the case for all of them? I would say almost certainly we can say no. For how many, maybe we can't say, but then we have to look at who they are, how they've been, and so on. We also know something else, or should know something else. Sometimes it's possible for a person to be influenced by more than one thing. That person can be influenced by sincere religious belief, as you put it, and also be influenced even a little more by some money that may come in. So it's difficult to measure, but again, I can only draw upon the studies that I've done and the research I've done and what I know from what many other people have done, and I think I can say with some assurance, or with some, I believe this, that a great many, a number of the leading evangelical Christian Zionists are sincere in their theology. And of course, the problem there is, as I think we all know, people who believe they are doing God's command and they're acting under God's orders, those people are extremely difficult to deal with if one wants to change their mind. And if they're doing things that we think are wrong and are bad, it's all the more difficult to try to convince them otherwise, because what human is going to be able to convince somebody who believes she or he is working in accordance with God's word? What human is going to be able to convince that person who sincerely believes that to believe or to do something opposite? That's the question.
Okay. I'm going to...
A few years ago, when I was in Israel, and I talked to Israeli leaders, and I said, don't you know about this theology? They gave me the answer that some of them were my relatives. They gave me the answer that I knew I'd get. They said, we think the theology is nonsense, but we're Machiavellian. We can understand that. Then I went to 3 Christian Zionist groups in Israel. They go for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And I asked them the same question. I got one answer from them, and from each of them got the same answer. And the one leader from one of the groups put it the best. And this talks to their theology. He said, listen, before I use the term, he said, we know that Israeli Jews think our theology is nonsense. That's what he said. But he said, we're not taking orders from them. We're taking orders from, and he did that. That tells you something.
The final person was a man named Fuad Shaban. The cultural and historical context of Islam and Christian Zionist thought in America. He gave a talk about the history. This is part of the panel. Just a short clip here.
Jews were so prosperous.
He's talking. By the way, he's talking about he grew up in Syria in Damascus, and he's talking about the fact that when we needed a doctor, we went to the Jewish doctor because we wanted to go to the best doctor. And then he's going to tell what happened. Could you turn the volume up a little?
Were taken to a doctor. The Jewish doctor was preferred by our parents. They were a very well-respected and prosperous community in Syria. Now, in 1947, and I remember that very clearly, some of my friends in the high school, Jewish, they were saying, we are now threatened if we do not leave for Israel, because we are hearing, and they used to receive notes and letters by mouth through oral correspondence, that if you stay, then you are going to be blamed for what has happened in Palestine. And they personally told me, we have to leave. We cannot stay. We're threatened not by you and Syrians, but we're threatened by those who tell us that if we don't leave for Israel, then we will be subject to their attacks. This has happened, and the result is they left. Now the propaganda is that they were driven out of Syria and of the Arab world, that their lands, their properties were confiscated and they had to leave. That did not happen. And I think the analogy of Jews being expelled from Spain, this is observed by many of the historians, Western historians, that they were given refuge by the Ottoman Empire, which is always accused of being extreme, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish. But this is, as Norton said, I think the ones who are louder usually get believed.
I'm stunned. I mean, of course, he's been given this propaganda all his life, but you see how the narrative is changing? Not only did the Jews just voluntarily leave back in 1947 and 48 when the war was going on, and they were being driven out of these Muslim countries, but they also they left Spain because they were being offered a nice place in Turkey under the Ottoman Empire. So that's why they left Spain. No, they were expelled from Spain, and they went to the Ottomans because the Ottomans wanted to tax them, and they wanted them to pay the tax. This is a rewriting of history. This is Bill Koenig, after sitting there and taking this for about an hour and a half. Bill, who I haven't asked him, I'm pretty sure that he was the only Christian Zionist in the room, because some of these comments received a lot of applause or laughter when they talked about people believing in God and the Bible and that type of thing. So here's a clip of Bill's question, which I think I've synced up to go with the video of the panel while he asked it.
Thank you. You know, by having watched and observed this region, the Middle East region, for many, many years, it seems to be the significant problem in the Middle East is radical Islam. We have it in Pakistan. We have it in Afghanistan. We have scathing comments of Khomeini and Ahmadinejad from Iran about Israel and about the great state of the United States. We have problems, sir, in your country right now where 60,000 innocent people have been killed. Radical Islam has worked its way into Syria. We have a very serious situation in Yemen. There is a dislike between the Saudis and Iran. We also have a very difficult situation right now with the Muslim Brotherhood inside of Egypt. Israel's borders before the Arab Spring were relatively secure. We also have the Emir of Qatar, who just gave $400 million to Hamas, who will not acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a state. The other thing is, who does Israel make peace with? Abbas hasn't been able to deliver. Hamas certainly doesn't sound like they want to make peace. But all we hear is it's a Christian Zionist problem. They're the reason that there isn't peace in the Middle East. But if you look at the Middle East, it's obviously that that's not the problem. It's radical Islam.
Now, the reason that one man looked was somebody was yelling in the background. That's not true that the Emir of Qatar gave $400 million to Hamas. It is true. But this goes to show, I mean, these are people that work in Washington, D.C. in the media that were attending this. There were attorneys and other, I would say, well-respected people there, but you get the point.
You're acting like Israel is not a player in creating its own problems. I mean, Israel has basically thrown away numerous opportunities for peace. The Saudi plan in 2003, there have been a number of overtures by Arab countries to try to make peace with Israel. Israel has always felt that, supported by the United States, it has basically a military monopoly and has been able to exercise that to keep the Arabs on their toes.
Camp David in 2000.
That's been misreported. I'm not going to argue about footnotes and things here, but.
Or facts, Bill says. Good for Bill. So this is
today we're talking about
many evangelical.
The clip that I've already played, and let me see. I want to. This clip, I won't play it. He says essentially that the people that are attracted to this are, the downtrodden middle class that have no hope. That's why they cling to their religion, essentially. We've heard that kind of thing from certain people before.
I have become addicted to watching television on Sunday and all of these Christian evangelist programs. And I defer to our psychologist here. Literally thousands of people listen to these people, listen to the preachers when they say Islam is evil, Muhammad is a terrorist. Those thousands, many of them are really well educated and they have their, a background of intellectual achievements. How do you counter that kind of mass propaganda? To me, that's the problem.
I would agree with him in the sense that mass propaganda is the problem. For example, Friday prayers on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, sometimes attended by hundreds of thousands of Muslims, one of which who is the Mufti, the most important holy man outside of Mecca in the Middle East, who last January 9th said this at a gathering such as this you see on the Temple Mount. Our war with the descendants of the apes and pigs is a war of religion and faith. This is to hundreds of thousands of people. Long live Fatah. I invite you, our honorable Sheikh, and now the Mufti will get up and he will speak. 47 years ago, the Fatah revolution started. Which revolution? The modern revolution of the Palestinian people's history. In fact, Palestine is in its entirety is a revolution. Since Caliph Umar came to conquer Jerusalem, 637 CE, and continuing today and until the end of days. The reliable Hadith tradition attributed to Muhammad in the two reliable collections says, the hour of resurrection will not come until you fight the Jews. The Jew will hide behind stones or trees. But then the stones or trees will call, O Muslim servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Except the gut tree, which is silent. Therefore, it is no wonder that you see those type of trees surrounding the Israeli settlements and colonies. Those crafty Jews. So anyway, I'm going to skip through this. You can watch the whole clips. Look, the whole thing was to mock and scoff at the end times. Peter says that there will be mockers coming in the last days, but that the Lord, is patient. He doesn't want anyone to perish. Bill has set up some meetings with these people to meet with them, to talk to them more one-on-one. They could obviously tell that there was some disagreement that he would have with their views. But know this, that the thing that I find troubling about 2 Peter chapter 3 is not so much that men like this, who are unsaved, unregenerate, will scoff at the second coming, but it's when pastors and Christian leaders scoff at the second coming, which I see as the more troubling trend. I did get a new book this week from Bill Salus about Psalm 83. He's updated his book, Israelistine. That's available. You can go to prophecydepot.com or prophecydepot.net and get that. Talks about the prophecy in Psalm chapter 83. And I'm saying this because it talks about an end time when there are people in the immediate area around Israel that say this, for behold, your enemies make an uproar, and those who hate you, who hate God, have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against your people and conspire together against your treasured ones. They have said, come and let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they have conspired together with one mind against you. They make a covenant. Who are these people? The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, the areas right around the nation of Israel, the Palestinian people, the Edomites, Jabal and Ammon and Amalek, the area of Jordan, Philistia, and the inhabitants of Tyre. That would be Lebanon. Philistia would be Gaza. They have become a help to the children of Lot. Deal with them as with Midian, that's the area of Saudi Arabia, as with Sisera and Jabin and the torrent of Kishon, at the torrent of Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became as dung for the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna. You can read about Zebah and Zalmunna in Judges chapter 8, verses 12 through 21. It talks about these people who rose up against the Israeli people at that time, the Jews, and tried to attack them. It's described in, by the way, interesting footnote, in most translations, pick up the fact that these Zebah and Zalmunna, they came from the area of Saudi Arabia wearing ornaments with the crescent moon on them. I would suggest to you that Muhammad did not get a new religion. He picked up an old pagan religion and used it for his political will. Okay, now, this is an alert that painful moment coming up, but this will only take a couple minutes, and she's going away for at least a little while, so you won't have to put up with her. But at the Newseum, the Museum of the News in Washington, she gave a global town hall, and here's just a couple clips from here, because I think these are important to see sort of how she views things.
North Africa, which has been very prominent lately. We've seen the Islamist extremists in Algeria, of course the ongoing problems in Libya, the crisis in Mali, in recent days violent protests in Egypt. How much of a global security threat is this region?
Well, it is becoming a threat, first and foremost, to the people of the region. This is not what the Arab Revolution was about, and there's a great deal of concern across the region about people who choose to use violence to try to impose their extremist views rather than participate in politics. It does have the potential, however, of expanding beyond the region, which is why I think you're seeing an international concern and coalition coming together to support the people of Mali, to stand by the government of Algeria, to work with the government of Libya, so that they themselves are given the tools they need to combat this extremist threat.
Well, at least she admits that it's an extremist threat, which is way beyond what most of the people in that administration will do. And then they ask her, well, you know, about your testimony before Congress, and here's some response.
Your passionate response to a Senate committee last week about what happened in Benghazi. When we were watching that hearing, we saw the Republican committee members go on the attack. Is Washington today more bitterly partisan than it was when you were First Lady, or has it always been like this and we just have a recency bias?
It has been increasingly partisan. It was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You can go back in history and see certain constituencies represented in our Congress and our politics certainly squaring off against each other. But it's become more so, and it's also resulted in less productivity. You know, you can be partisan, you can have a strong sense of the rightness of your position, but democracy and certainly legislative bodies require compromise. And you can't let compromise become a dirty word, because then you veer toward fanaticism. I mean, we were just talking about extremists who think it's only their way, they're the ones who have the truth, none of the rest of us have any kind of claim on what is real in their views. And so it's important in our democracies, you know, like Australia, like the United States, that yes, be passionate, be intense about your feelings, but at the end of the day, you've got to serve the people who sent you there, and that requires compromise.
Because, of course, she is the epitome of compromise, and her party is the epitome of compromise. But did you see how she equivocated the extremists in the Middle East with the extremists that were questioning her in Congress in the Senate hearings last week? So rather than rely just on Hillary, I thought we would turn to two experts on the Middle East to get some very good insight about the Middle East. And this would be, oh wait, no, that's not them. Actually, if you want to watch that love fest that took place on 60 Minutes, go, but it will, I want you to watch. I'm going to play a couple clips. I will send you the link. You should watch Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson. It is an excellent show. It comes from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Peter is an excellent interviewer. The two gentlemen that he is interviewing here on the left, or in the middle of this picture, is Norman Podhoretz, who teaches at Hillsdale College and is the publisher, editor of Commentary Magazine. And the man on the right, who is someone you should read one of his books at least, a man named Bernard Lewis, a professor emeritus of history at Princeton University, one of the great minds on the Middle East. Now, I'm going to go till noon. The game doesn't start till like 6:30, so you'll have time to get home, order the pizza, everything before the game. I'm going to play a couple of these clips. I think these are very important. A couple of these are about 7 minutes long, but they're having a discussion on a cruise about a month ago that the Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution put on. And I want you to listen to these two, what I consider two of the wisest men about what's going on in the Middle East, and what two of the most honest historians talking about, and how it contrasts with the interview you just saw at the museum with the now former Secretary of State Clinton, and this mess of Christian Zionist attacking that was going on in Washington this week. So here's the first clip.
American exceptionalism in the world. Again, two quotations. Once again, President Obama speaking in 2009 in Cairo. Quote, "We meet at a time of great tension between the United States and Muslims. Tension has been fed by colonialism that denied rights and opportunities to many Muslims, and a Cold War in which Muslim-majority countries were too often treated as proxies." Close quote. Quotation number two. Bernard Lewis, in the interview in the Jerusalem Post in 2011, quote, "People who talk about American imperialism in the Middle East either know nothing about America or know nothing about the Middle East."
Or both.
Or both. Bernard, so the President of the United States, at some basic level, did not know what he was talking about in Cairo.
That's not unprecedented.
What is it that he doesn't understand about the United States and or the Middle East to suggest that we've been imperialists there? Or at a minimum, overbearing there?
It depends what you mean by imperialism. I think that one might not unreasonably use the term imperialist to describe some of the processes by which the original small group of states increased to the present number. But as applied to American policy...
The Western migration,
yes,
right. In this
but as applied to American policy in the Middle East, it is absurdly inappropriate.
Okay, here's another one.
Bernard Lewis, quote, "I can imagine a situation in which the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations of the same kind obtain control of much of the Arab world, and if that happens, they would gradually sink back into medieval squalor," close quote. Does the Muslim Brotherhood, do the radicals in the world of Islam genuinely wish to reestablish some kind of caliphate?
Well, I don't know whether I will use the word caliphate, but they certainly wish to establish an Islamic political order, political and social order, yes.
That would occupy what we think of as the territory, roughly, broadly speaking, of the former Northern Africa up through
yes,
that is seriously on the agenda.
Oh yes, I'm sure it is.
That seems clear to you as well?
Absolutely clear. I mean, they say it all the time.
Exactly.
And
you take them seriously.
Well, I've become an octogenarian, and if I've acquired any wisdom at all, it consists in taking at face value the threats of one's enemies. There's a kind of pathology at work in the world that refuses to believe. Somebody says, "I want to kill you." You say, well, he can't possibly mean that.
Beginning with Mein Kampf, he didn't really mean
right. And we can do business with Herr Hitler, as I forget who said it, Chamberlain, as a matter of fact, said. So you have a country like Iran, which of course is Muslim, and which repeatedly declares its intention to wipe Israel off the map. And many people still refuse to take that. They say it's rhetoric. I remember the late Hannah Arendt described the rhetoric of Eichmann, who said he would go to his grave happy at the thought of having massacred millions of Jews. And she said, this was sheer rodomontade, my fancy word that means exaggerated rhetoric. Red meat for the consumption of the base. Well, he meant it, and Hitler meant it, and Ahmadinejad means it, and I think the Muslim Brotherhood means it, and not just in relation to Israel.
You agree with all of that, Bernard? Why is it, if the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to reestablish what they understand as the greatness of Islam, why aren't they listening to you and thinking of looking within their own political tradition to reestablish some kind of consultative, balanced, prudent, wise political order of the kind that at its best did characterize the Islamic world? Instead, they're crazy, radical hotheads.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Why they don't seem to understand their own history and tradition? Is that so?
Unfortunately, as I said before, the process of modernization.
Well, when you say modernization, what do you mean? You mean post the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the end of the First World War?
the introduction of modern science, technology, business, etc. In all features of modern life, including most especially communication.
So when you say that they will sink back to, if they win, they'll sink back to medieval squalor, it's because they will try to, they actually consider these developments antithetical to their own civilization, to their own religion?
Well, they would use those developments in order to restore what they imagine to be the golden age of Islam.
Well, let me quote Bernard Lewis at himself. Bernard once pointed out in a passage that I have quoted at least 6 times in print that the modern political Islamic radicalism has as much owes as much to both communism and Nazism as it does to the traditions of Islam. He points out that the Germans came into the Middle East during World War II, and its political program and organization had a lot to do, for example, with the founding of the Ba'ath parties. And when the war was over, the communists moved in, and the political forces, the Islamic political forces, also learned a lot of lessons from the communists and how to operate politically. So you had these two major totalitarian forces of the 20th century basically invading the 7th century culture of the Islamic world, and it led to what I like to call Islamofascism.
There's an important principle which I think needs to be remembered. The Arabic saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Since the dominant civilization in the Western world was a Western democratic system, we were seen as the wicked imperialists who were dominating the Middle East. And therefore, our enemies were their friends. So that during the Nazi period they were pro-Nazi, and after that they were pro-Soviet.
Bernard, you knew, this is just occurring to me, you knew, or at least you met Gaddafi, and you knew quite well King Hussein of Jordan.
Yes, I do both of them.
What did those two men want? If you could say, if you may have the Arab world as you wish to arrange it, what would it have looked like if Gaddafi had had his way? What would it have looked like if Hussein had had his way? You don't know.
Not pretty.
Not pretty? In either case? I always took King Hussein as someone who's trying to move the Arab world into the
Well, you know, King Hussein has a reputation for benevolence that he does not deserve. And I'll give you one example of what King Hussein, the wonderful King Hussein, did. When King Hussein ruled what is called the West Bank of the mandatory Palestine, he used an ancient Jewish graveyard for set up latrines in this ancient Jewish graveyard, using the headstones for the foundation. That's one of many not very attractive
Not
things.
such a nice guy after all.
He was not such a nice guy. He was British educated, he had a good accent, he was charming. Didn't he have an American wife?
He did?
Yeah, well, so
Queen Noor,
so everybody loved it.
Well, I'm going to skip over the next clip.
If Iran gets the... Islam has brought...
Well, I'll tell you what.
Countless millions of...
I'm trying to decide what to do here because we're just about out of time. Next week, we will cover Iran and all the other things that went on in the Middle East. I think this was a good foundational thing. We will play the clips. You can watch it. But we'll play the clips about Iran and the bomb and what's going on in the Middle East. You need to know that there's a lot of things that are happening with that. And I wish we had another hour or two to go. I will be here next week, Sunday the 16th. I'll be in Florida. We'll do a little Mike Clapham and I doing a prophecy conference down there. Mike Pamperin, former Grace Brethren pastor, one of the elders here at church, was going to be teaching you about the proper way to look at Genesis 1. It will be very good. He has been going back into this about, there's this view today that it's really not all that important how you look at Genesis 1. It can be an old earth, it can be a young earth, it's just whatever you want, it's the story, and it's not that important, the details and that type of thing. And I think Michael will blow that to smithereens in the hour that he has with you in 2 weeks. There were some things that happened in Israel this week. There was the attack on the Syrian convoy going to someplace in Lebanon. Maybe some people say as many as 4 sites in Syria were hit. Iran and Syria are saying they're going to retaliate against Israel. The whole thing is sort of, shall we say, volatile, tinderbox at the moment. Nobody knows what's going to happen. We know that in the long run, Jesus comes back and there's peace. In the meantime, there's some trouble. So remember what it says in Matthew. When you see these things begin to happen, what do? Look up, because your redemption draws nigh. So thank you very much.